Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This episode of True Murder is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading name in digital audiobooks, with over 180,000 best-selling books featuring the world's very best narrators. Right now, you can get a free audiobook of your choice when you sign up for a 30-day free trial. Go to audiblepodcast.com/truemurder. That's audiblepodcast, one word, .com/truemurder today and experience Audible audiobooks. Hitchhiking from Eugene, Oregon through Northern California in 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan thumbed a ride into hell. Her kidnappers, a sadistic lumber mill worker, Cameron Hooker, and his battered wife, Janice, subjected her to 7 years of torture and sensory deprivation. She was made a sex slave, kept locked in a wooden box, and brainwashed into believing that an underground network of sadists would recapture her if she attempted to escape. Did Colleen fall in love with Cameron and make herself a willing partner in a love triangle, as the hooker's defense lawyer asserted? The jury found otherwise, convinced by the evidence marshaled by coauthor McGuire, state prosecutor in the case, a trial that journalist Carla Norton attended in 1984. The book Not for the Squeamish, this harrowing tale shuttles between the courtroom and the grisly doings in the hooker's basement. The book that we're featuring this evening is Perfect Victim, the true story of the girl in the box, by the district attorney who prosecuted her captor, with my special guest, journalist and author, Carla Norton. Welcome back to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Carla Norton.
Thank you, Dan, for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure. This is, I've mentioned before, this is a true crime classic, and it's going to be a treat for everyone, especially me. I've loved this book for years, and we finally get you to talk about this incredible story. So let's start off with, this book was put on the reading list for the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, and it was a #1 best-selling New York Times bestseller. Tell us a little bit about your background. Pardon me, sorry?
I said that surprised me.
Absolutely. Now tell us a little bit about your background, Carla, and tell us how you came to be the author of Perfect Victim.
Well, that is an unusual story. I actually was living in Tokyo, Japan when this case broke, and I was working full-time as an associate editor with the Japanese edition of Reader's Digest. I had just finished editing a book when this story started hitting the newspaper headlines, and what hit me immediately was that it was Red Bluff, California, and I grew up in Redding, which is just 30 miles north of there. So
right.
From the distance of Tokyo, this is virtually my backyard. And when I first saw the headlines that this woman claimed to have been held captive for 7 years, I just didn't believe the story. I thought, that's ridiculous. That couldn't possibly happen in Red Bluff. And the AP Wire Service kept running stories about it, and I was fascinated. And when it just happened that this broke shortly before I was going on vacation back to visit my family in California. And while I was there, I learned more about the case, and it was just one of those cases that I couldn't stop asking questions because of the mind control issues, the slavery contract, the wife that was involved, just the bizarreness of this case was outside of anything I'd ever heard of. I'd never heard of Stockholm Syndrome. I didn't know about abusive relationships to this extent. And I thought, this is just an extraordinary case, and somebody's going to write about it. And I had just, like I say, just finished working on a book as an editor of a book by a KGB agent who spied in Japan and then defected to the United States. And I'd never thought that I would write true crime, but I just became kind of fixated on this case. So I did what you're not supposed to do. I cold called an agent in New York. I told him the story, and he said, "You're living where? In Tokyo?" I see. And if he had said, "Well, I'm sorry, but there's no way you can write the story," I probably wouldn't have pursued it. But he said, "Well, quit your job with Reader's Digest, come back to the States, cover the trial. This is what you need to do." And he laid it out for me. And so, not knowing what I was getting into at all, that's what I did. I quit my job. I came back to the States, and I attended the trial, and then ended up co-authoring Perfect Victim with Christy McGuire, the prosecutor.
Okay, Carla, let's go back now. You mentioned that interestingly, you grew up in Reading, which is the closest place, but in proximity, it's about 130 miles from Sacramento. So tell us where Red Bluff, California is, in Northern California, and in relation to other places that we might know more of if we're not from California.
Sure. It would be northeast of San Francisco, and if you start in Sacramento, which is California's capital, and go up the Sacramento Valley, you're actually following the Sacramento River. The headwaters of the Sacramento are up there by Lake Shasta, and the Sacramento runs right through Reading and Red Bluff down to Sacramento, and then out the delta to the Bay Area. So it's at the end of a valley. It's kind of a rural. It's a small town still, and it was smaller then, with a lumber mill and cattle ranchers. An annual rodeo, one high school, and a few older Victorian homes, but nothing fancy. I mean, it wasn't a place where there were a lot of tourists. It's more for kind of the hunting, fishing community, that sort of milieu.
Right. Now tell us a little bit about Cameron Hooker. His father's Harold and his mother is Lorena Hooker. So tell us a little bit about his background, his early life, and where he's originally from and where they're from.
You know what? I'm going to forget exactly. I remember he has a younger brother whose name is Dexter.
Right.
But the thing that came up about you would think that someone who became this sort of criminal would have a background of abuse or acting out, but there really wasn't anything that came to the fore. Now, granted, his family isn't going to come up and say, "Oh, yes, we abused him as a child," but they said he was no trouble. That it was, and everybody said if you lined up 10 guys, Cameron would be the last one you would pick for this kind of thing, because he was very quiet and kept to himself. And what came out in the trial is that he became fixated as a teenager on this idea of kidnapping a girl and holding her captive. That was his teenage fantasy, and he collected pornography, and that was like some boys now might, get obsessed about computers or some sports. That was his obsession, was this idea of holding someone captive, and he dedicated a lot of his daydreaming life, apparently, to that idea. Then, when he was a young man, that's when he met Janice. I think it was, she was 15 when she was introduced to him. and I think he was then
19.
18, 19. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And so Janice is the one who, in all of this, is the most perplexing, and she's the one who changes and actually finally set Colleen free. So when you think about her, she was 15 when she met him, and they dated for a year and a half, I think, before they were married. So he was her whole world. She went from being a child to being his wife, and he introduced her to sex as being strung up between the trees in the woods and whipped. I mean, he said that's what everybody did. So that was her education and her own indoctrination into an abusive relationship.
Yes, you outline right from Janice herself where she didn't really think she was loved or had never heard the expression that, that she was loved. She was raised mostly by her sister Lisa, and then interaction with boys, she just wanted to be wanted. And so part of the deal with Cameron was that he was very, very nice to her after he whipped her and hung her. She found these things peculiar, but she had no sexual experience. But he was so affectionate, so nice, and she really hadn't received any attention. And when she went to her parents for permission to get married, and there was a threat that she wanted to keep him so badly that she said that she was pregnant and then promised him to marry. So you could see from, as you outlined in the book, a very pathetic, very, very needy character entering into partnership with Cameron Hooker, wittingly and unwittingly to a certain degree.
Yeah, so you can see that she was a victim in her own right, even though she became an accomplice with Colleen. I mean, she started down this path not knowing what love was. I mean, who really knows that at 15, 16 years old? And he's the first boy who ever really paid much attention to her. She's not a particularly attractive young woman, and she's rather soft-spoken, and he comes into her life. He's very tall. He's 6'4", lanky, reasonably good-looking guy, and everybody seemed to like him. He was someone that people got along with. He didn't cause a ruckus. He wasn't someone who was outwardly violent. He didn't, get drunk and cause problems. And that was part of the reason that it was so hard to believe this had gone on for so many years, because he did not draw attention to himself. He was always busy. He worked in the lumber mill, and he had projects. He would build fences and whatnot. So he seemed like he was a fairly industrious young man. And the two of them rented a place from an older couple who lived next door, Mr. and Mrs. Letty, who thought they were just a nice, young, wholesome couple.
Now, you introduce early on in this Colleen Stan. Her father's Jack Martin. She had been married early on herself, and in a failed marriage within about a year. And you said she was living a little bit on the fringe. So tell us a little bit more about Colleen Stan at this time. And she is from Eugene, Oregon. And tell us a little bit about Colleen Stan.
She was raised in Southern California, in Riverside, California, but she moved to Eugene with a couple of friends, so she had roommates, and she'd had, some trouble in her life, a broken family, a young, short divorce, marriage and divorce at a young age, and she was living in Eugene, and you can imagine Eugene, Oregon it's a college town, and so this is 1977, and a lot of free spirits and Beatles music, right? And so she decided that she was going to naively hitchhike down Interstate 5 from Oregon to visit a friend, to surprise a friend in Northern California on her birthday. And one of the chilling things for me for this, when I think about this, is that I also hitchhiked that same stretch of freeway when I was about her age, foolishly.
Right.
So I actually keep a copy of Perfect Victim in the car, and when I see girls hitchhiking, I offer them a copy and insist they read it as the price for a ride, and I lecture them that they should hitchhike. But but Colleen was not being, completely ludicrous in her actions. She turned down a ride with a bunch of guys. She was careful about who she would accept a ride with, and when she got down to Red Bluff, here was a man, his wife, and their infant. And let me backtrack a little bit, that Cameron had his abuse, his sadomasochistic experiments with his wife Janice became more and more extreme, and they were frightening to her. And so finally they cut a deal, which is hard to fathom, but if she could have a child, then he could have a slave, was the deal they cut. And so she had a child, and he was looking. And he had his preparation ready, and there was Colleen, who accepted a ride with them, which looked quite safe. And they, I think she was going to Westwood, and if I recall correctly, it's about an hour and a half east of Red Bluff. So they headed off in that direction, and then at one point, and I think this is interesting, they stopped at a gas station, and she went in and used the restroom, and Colleen recalls that she had an intuition, or heard a voice, as she put it, telling her to run away, that she should jump out the window and run away, that there was still time. And she thought, why am I thinking this? This doesn't make sense. But that was her instinct. And you can see that she knew something was wrong with this couple. The way he kept looking at her in the mirror, there was just something off about them. But she talked herself out of it and got back in the car. And when she got back in the car, there was a box on the seat next to her, which she would learn later what that was. But in the meantime, they said, well, we want to go down this road and look at some ice caves. We hear there are some ice caves. Do you mind? We're going to take a detour. And so they took her down a dirt road. Janice got out of the car with the baby and walked down to a stream, and Cameron came around and put a knife to her throat and told her she better do what he told her to do. And he had everything ready. He gagged her, he blindfolded her, and then he put this head box on, and I've tried on that head box. I have a photograph of it in the book. It was introduced as evidence. It's a double-walled, very heavy, insulated head box, which is, it latches around your throat, and it sits on your head. I think it weighs about 20 pounds. It's got heavy latches, and it's a sensory deprivation device. I mean, basically, for one thing, you can scream in that, and it would muffle your screams. But it's also just a terrifying thing to have latched onto you. Then he tied her up. He covered her with a blanket, and he laid her down in the back of the car, and then signaled Janice back, and they drove into Red Bluff and smuggled her into the basement. And that became a nightmare beyond, I mean, I can't even fathom being locked in a closet for 3 days. And to be locked in the kind of bizarre situation she was in. Should I just keep talking? I feel like I'm going
Sure.
on and on.
No, certainly. I don't want to break the narrative.
Well, just try to imagine that you are shut in, taken down into a small concrete cold basement, and then placed inside essentially a coffin. You know, it was a box that he had made that was about freezer size from the outside, and too small for her even to sit up in. And that's where she was kept for so long. I mean, for such a long period of time. Try to imagine the first week of the terror. When am I going to get out? What's wrong with these people? He would let her out and whip her, hang her by the wrists and whip her, abuse her in various ways, and then put her back in the box. And she didn't know if she was going to be killed. Sometimes she'd be let out to go to the bathroom or to eat something. But he wouldn't answer questions. She lost track of time. The days turned into weeks, turned into months. She lost 40 pounds. She stopped menstruating. Just the simple thing of, daylight, fresh air. That was all completely outside of her experience for that period of time. She wasn't allowed to bathe. There was no personal grooming. He would bring down, basically a bucket for her to use for her waist. At one point, they did take her upstairs, blindfolded, always blindfolded. She didn't see his face. She was constantly blindfolded. She was brought upstairs to bathe, and basically he experimented with drowning her in the tub. She was whipped.
Let's talk about that. I wanted to mention that because I think that's one of the most dramatic things when you say that she was allowed to bathe. He tied her legs to a broomstick, dunked her in the water, again blindfolded, and dunked her in the water. It's like a near drowning. So it wasn't a bathing.
And what's interesting is that he had done something similar with Janice when they were dating, that he had taken her to a stream and held her underwater. So again, he was acting out these sadistic fantasies of his, that, Janice had endured this abuse, and now he had someone else, that was his entertainment. I mean, he electrocuted her. She has scars from electrocution. I mean, basically anything that he could think about, he would do. But that for 9 months, I want to now say that she was kidnapped in May of 1977. So for the next 9 months, whenever she was let out of the box, she had to have her blindfold on. They did give her some jobs to do. He built a workroom under the stairs, and he would, take her into this workroom, which I imagine was just a couple of steps. It's a very small basement, and give her macrame projects to do. So she could take the blindfold off and do these macrame projects, and then she had to put the blindfold back on when she was let out again, so that she wasn't supposed to look at him, she wasn't supposed to ask any questions, she didn't know his name. And then finally one day he takes the blindfold off, and in front of her is a slavery contract, which he and Janice had created. He'd actually taken the wording out of a hardcore pornography magazine, apparently, and recreated it, and he gave her a slave name. He told her that from now on your name is Kay, and that he belonged to a company of slave traders who were watching the house and had members in the police, and some neighbors were involved, and if she ever tried to escape, that anyone who tried to help her would be killed, and that she would be crucified and hung, I think, for 3 days or something. I mean, just these horrible, horrible stories that he would weave in with the truth, so that at that point, she had completely been brainwashed. And I have to make a comparison here with Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst was locked in a closet for 45 days. Her life was threatened. Remember, she was stolen out of her dormitory room by the SLA. Right. Her life is threatened. She's raped. She's kept locked in this closet, and after 45 days, she becomes Tanya. I mean, they gave her a slave name, essentially, and a slave identity. And that was just 45 days. I mean, that sounds pretty horrific to me, but compared to what Colleen Stan went through, what Colleen went through is just unfathomable. The amazing thing is that she survived, and we can talk later about another woman that resisted, and I believe he murdered. But she signed the slavery. He said, "If you don't sign it for you, I'll sign it for you and make you wish you had." So she signs this slavery contract with her shaking hand, and then they let her upstairs to do chores after the baby's asleep, and she would wash dishes or, clean the bathroom, whatever jobs they would give her. She became quite literally their slave, but also a sex slave. I mean, he would abuse her. And at some point, this became too much for Janice, and she kind of tried to flee the relationship. She took a job down in Silicon Valley, which is about 200 miles south of there. South of San Francisco is Silicon Valley, the San Jose area. And she would work during the week and stay with her sister, and then she'd go back home for the weekend. And that only lasted for a while. They had kind of a sketchy, financial arrangement. They would also take these macrames that Colleen made for them and sell them at a flea market down there. Meanwhile, he was working at the lumber mill and a very hard worker. But people noticed that, boy, as soon as his shift was up, he was out of there, and he went home because he had more interesting things planned for his evening hours. But they both were extremely secretive. No word was ever uttered about the true situation in that house.
Tell us about Janice in terms of her idea, because she's, again, we got to really talk about how important the Bible becomes to this story and how important it is to Jan and how important it is to Colleen and important to this story. But also, if you could tell us about what Jan thought about monogamy and Cameron's exclusivity with her, because this is important to the story as well.
Well, I think what you're thinking about is that Janice thought that that Colleen's relationship with Cam, or Kay, we'll call her Kay at this point, she's the slave, that her relationship was consensual in some way. And also that he told her that he wasn't having sex with her or he didn't rape her. I think he lied to her about that sexual relationship, and she tried to just compartmentalize and not go down in the basement. But the Bible is important here because he used the Bible in the coercion of these two. And over time, this relationship evolved. And there's a story in the Bible about Sarah and Hagar. And Sarah is the wife and Hagar is the slave. And this is in the Old Testament. And he would have Colleen read the Bible aloud, and he told her that it was a biblical relationship. And so he was so insidious. He used the Bible as part of his, coercive arsenal. And so that was a brainwashing technique that he used. But it became so overwhelming to Jan. At one point, Jan asked Cameron to kill her. She wanted him to strangle her. She didn't want to live anymore. And he put his hands around her neck and choked her, but then clearly did not kill her. So there was periods of extreme intensity, and then also during this time, it's important that Jan had another child. Now, both these children are girls. And so now Colleen is let out, and she's a babysitter. They moved from the first house, which is right downtown on Oak Street, in a small house in downtown Red Bluff, and they moved to a mobile home. And you would think, okay, now what's he going to do? Because there's no basement there. Well, he was quite inventive, and he built a large pedestal for the bed, and then underneath that was a compartment, which was roughly, again, the size of a coffin. And so then Colleen slept underneath the bed. and it was quite stuffy and hot down there. The ventilation was awful. And what she had for company was he gave her a radio. So she would listen to the religious station. And now this is Colleen's story that has never really been told, but she had a religious epiphany at some point, and I'm hoping that she will write about that. I know she's working on her memoirs, but she became quite religious and has told me that she feels that God saved her. So during that time, then she would be let out, and she would even go out into the yard and meet neighbors, but they knew her as the live-in babysitter, and she was Kay, and she didn't, engage in conversation beyond, looks like it's going to rain or something like that, because she was afraid of the neighbors. She thought they were part of the company. And Cameron, as part of his indoctrination, she had to ask permission for anything that she would do. All of her activities were very controlled. And then I think we have to come up to a really phenomenal event, and that was that in the middle of this 7-year period, Cameron did something extraordinary, and he decided to let Colleen visit her family, and this became a real sticking point in the trial. But he actually drove her down to Southern California, to Riverside, California, and out of the blue, Colleen appears, visits her family, and he tells her that, I think he told her they were going to stay for 3 days, and of course that didn't happen. He just wanted to kind of test his slave. By that, he had such confidence in the control of her at that point. And this is not unlike, for example, what happened with Patty Hearst or with Elizabeth Smart or J.C. Dugard. Those I think are especially interesting cases because Elizabeth Smart and J.C. Dugard were also kidnapped by a husband and wife team, and also had interactions with the public, but were too afraid to tell anyone who they really were. So there are real similarities between these cases. But anyway, so she was let to visit her family, but then Cameron abruptly cut that visit short and took her away. He was introduced as her boyfriend, and Colleen could have said something in retrospect, but she was so afraid that he would hurt her family, that the company would come and make good on these terrible promises. And it had happened to her. I mean, this was her life experience now for, I think it was 3 years at that point. So she knew that this could happen, this horrible, unthinkable thing could happen. So it wasn't outside the realm of plausibility that the company could do something horrible to her family. So he took her back up to Red Bluff, and at that point I think he had misgivings that maybe he had overstepped his bounds or was afraid that they might come looking for her, and he shut her back in the box for a really extensive period of time where she was only let out at night for about the next 3 years. The girls didn't know where she'd gone. She was this live-in babysitter, and now suddenly she's gone. And yet she was living in the house. That's how intense her isolation was, and that kind of control. And you can see now why it's so unfathomable that, until you see the evidence, you see the photographs of him, hanging her up by the wrists, and you hear the corroboration between Janice and Colleen about all of this, and a lot of this he admitted to. That was what was really astonishing, that he took the stand. So I'm kind of jumping ahead to the trial at this point, but
Let's
finally,
go. Let's
okay. Go ahead.
Let's go back. Sorry. Let's go back to really the situation that ends up being the savior of Colleen. Again, we talked a little bit about the Bible, but the thing that that Cameron really miscalculated was that he allowed these women even to go to church and to have a relationship and to form a bond between them, which at one time, because Jan was jealous, somewhat afraid of the consequences, and also shameful, but then also jealous that she was a competing woman in the household, so it had this complex situation psychologically for her. So tell us a little bit more about the bonding process, because at one time he shut her away because there was so much tension in the house between the two women.
The two of them, I guess, were fighting quite a bit before he shut her away so much. And then he, I think, felt confident enough in 1984, and I remember she's kidnapped in 1977, and then she, in 1984, he let her out and let the two of them go to church together. So Janice and Colleen now were quite religious, and they went to hear Pastor Frank Dabney at the Church of Nazarene, who gave them a different interpretation of the Bible than Cameron had been giving them. And then that summer, the summer of 84, he also let Colleen get a job. And she worked as a motel maid. She would ride her bike to the motel, she'd clean the rooms, she would come home, and she would give her money to Cameron. And that's all she did. She didn't really... One woman tried to befriend her and brought her home from work once. I can't remember if it was raining. Yeah, I think it was raining, and so she took her home in her car. And Colleen invited her inside, and Cameron did not like that. He wouldn't even speak to her, just glared at her. And so she had really overstepped her bounds. But if he had seen then, he was losing control by then, in a sense, because Colleen was starting to go out and Janice was starting to go out. And Janice was having what she called a nervous breakdown. And I think the underlying thing, besides the tension and also friendship between the two of them, because they were both victims of Cameron hookers. He was
Right.
the dominant one, and they were both his toys, his submissive slaves, essentially. But Janice had the additional burden of having two daughters, and now they're getting a little bit older, and it begins to dawn on her that it's not a good thing to be a female in this household with Cameron Hooker around. How long can this go on before they become victims also? And I think this became a real crisis for her. And Pastor Dabney started to give them a more loving, more modern interpretation, not this Old Testament, slaves, obey your masters stuff, but, about a loving relationship between husband and wife. And finally, the two of them confided in him to some degree, to some limited degree. He didn't really understand what all had gone on, but he, told them they needed to get away. And so this was the dramatic moment, because Colleen all this time had believed in the company. And Janice at some point had told her, we need to get away, and she would say no, because the company would come after us. And Janice felt this burden that she was continuing this lie to now her only friend. I mean, who else understood the situation they were in? Only the two of them understood.
Right.
And so finally she had to tell her tearfully that it was all a lie. She went and, while Colleen was working, she said, I have to tell you, there is no company of slave traders. This is all a lie. And, the two of them just kind of broke down and hugged each other. And then it was getting late, and Cameron was coming home at 4 o'clock from work. And the only thing that they could do was pretend for that night, pretend that everything was normal so that they could escape the next day. And so he came home. Janice said she wasn't feeling well. She slept on the floor with Colleen that night. And then the next day he went to work, and while he was gone, they gathered up the things. They gathered up the things for the children, and the two of them fled together. Colleen had contacted her father again out of the blue. He hadn't heard from her in 3 years. and asked him to wire her dollars to buy a bus ticket, and she took the bus home. But Janice pleaded with her not to tell the police, not to tell anyone what had happened. And so that's what Colleen did. She didn't tell anyone. It was finally Janice who told the police. And so she is the first victim. She is an accomplice during Colleen's captivity. She mothers 2 children, and then she's the one who sets Colleen free. I never met the girls. The girls did not testify. They didn't come to court. But I talked to Janice after the trial, and what struck me was that she seemed so washed out and so much older than she was. Very lined. Her hands looked old. Her face was lined. Her hair was dingy. And Colleen, at that point, had endured so much abuse. She had very thin hair. You could see through to her scalp. She hadn't been to a dentist all this time. Her teeth were bad. I mean, she has chronic back problems to this day, not to mention the scars from the handcuffs and the whippings. So, I mean, what she endured was horrible. What Janice endured also was terrible. And the 2 of them finally talked to the police together. And at the preliminary hearing, they were kind of a team. But by the time the trial had come around, I think Colleen had regained more of her self-esteem and a kind of a sense of self-preservation, and she was very standoffish to Janice, because then she recognized that she had been an accomplice and she could have told her years ago that there was no company of slave traders. The 2 of them could have escaped together, in the first week, for that matter. So I know that Colleen is still very religious, and she is a very forgiving and kind person. But at that point, I think she had to kind of reclaim her identity. I know it took her a long time to do that. So, but the other thing that happened is that this story was so outlandish. When it did hit headlines, there was this whole thing of blaming the victim. And there's a quote that I have in the book from Patty Hearst that I want to read. She said, "When you are held captive, people somehow expect you to spit in your captor's face and get killed." And that's the truth. I mean, people thought, well, why didn't she just beat him up? I mean, why didn't she run away? Especially men, they'd say, well, I would have just punched him in the face and, run off. Well, first of all, he was much bigger than she was, much stronger. I mean, Colleen's only about 5'4", and he's 6'4". And that's besides the mental coercion, which was just such an enlightening part of that trial. Dr. Chris Hatcher is the captivity expert who testified. And that whole aspect, just to see how systematic her coercion was, or brainwashing in layperson's terms, that he used every tool that he could to disorient her, to threaten her, to isolate her, to take away her sense of privacy, to alternate reward and punishment for no reason, to force her to do different behaviors, to reduce her food and water, starve her, abuse her, shame her. I mean, he did every aspect of control. Because again, that was his passion, and he had studied that. That was his hobby, his vocation, basically. And he's such a psychopath. And now, I didn't really understand psychopaths when I was attending this trial. But Judge Knight, who's the judge, when he sentenced Cameron Hooker, mentioned his high degree of cruelty and callousness. And that is so characteristic of psychopaths, that they don't have remorse. He's an utterly remorseless human being. He sees nothing wrong with what he did, which is why he took the stand in his own defense. He admitted he
we're going to use this as an opportunity to pause for a message from our sponsor. We'll get right back to incredible story of perfect victim. This episode of True Murder is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading name in digital audiobooks. Experience Audible audiobooks today and get a free audiobook of your choice. Consider, for example, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. It was published in 1965. Best-selling author Truman Capote's true crime masterpiece and the #2 best-selling true crime book in history, masterfully narrated by Scott Brick. Or Helter Skelter, a true crime classic and the biggest-selling true crime book in history. Author Vincent Bugliosi Jr., the Los Angeles District Attorney who co-authored Helter Skelter and who prosecuted Charles Manson and members of his murderous family, he just recently passed away. This is the #1 true crime book in history. You can listen to the Audible audiobook version narrated by Scott Brick again. Another selection is Life After Death by Damien Echols. Damien was part of the West Memphis Three and spent 18 years on death row, falsely accused of murdering 3 boys. He and his friends were eventually exonerated in 2011, and the book chronicles his journey from the accusation to his eventual release from prison. The book has great reviews and is chillingly narrated by Damien Echols himself. Also, many of the incredible authors that have appeared on True Murder have their books now available as Audible audiobooks. Tonight's guest, for example, Carla Norton's has Perfect Victim is available, and other recent True Murder guests, Catherine Casey's Deliver Us, Steve Jackson's No Stone Unturned, Kathy Scott's Murder of a Mafia Daughter, Daylene Berry's Pretty Little Killers, Johan Hari's Chasing the Scream, Fred Rosen's Flesh Collectors, Charles Graeber's The Good Nurse, Diane Fanning's Undercover of the Night, and J.T. Hunter's The Vampire Next Door. So, including Carla Norton's Perfect Victim, there are many true crime masterpieces and classics and books that you really should be looking into and experience the Audible experience itself. There's no replacing the book, the paperback, the hardcover, or the ebook, but Audible is a completely different experience. So you can get a free audiobook of your choice when you sign up for a 30-day trial. Go to audiblepodcast.com/truemurder. That's audiblepodcast, one word, .com/truemurder. When we last left off, Carla, we were talking about the trial. We kind of skipped over the actual arrest of Cameron Hooker, the kind of lawyer that he obtained and, of course, retained, I should say, and also the various challenges that this case encountered, including right from the very beginning. So tell us a little bit about Christine McGuire and her fight to have this case, for her to prosecute it and for this case to be prosecuted, because at one time it didn't look like it was going to happen.
That's right. At one point they were saying that they didn't have the funds to try the case, and so they were going to have to plead it out because they didn't have the money to try it. But that actually, you can't cite that. That's not a legal reason to not have a trial. And so luckily they did try the case. And what was interesting was that there are no, except for assault and mayhem, there really are no charges for torture. And so what Christine had to do was focus instead on the sex charges, on the sexual assaults, and because those had the highest sentencing rate, and that those could be charged and then the terms served consecutively. But the tough thing was this kidnapping. Now, Cameron Hooker's point of view, and his attorney, Dr. Roland Papendick, the attorney representing him, their point of view was that the statute of limitations had lapsed, and then she stayed because she wanted to. And what was interesting was that they brought forth something no one knew they had, and that was love letters that Colleen had written to Cameron Hooker. And they put forth in his defense that this was proof that she was in love with him and she stayed because she wanted to. And it was only in the cross-examination when Christine McGuire was able to, on her expert witness, Dr. Chris Hatcher, that they went through those love letters line by line, and he pointed out that they're addressed to Dear Master. I'm writing you this letter because you told me to, and it would be signed Your Slave. So it wasn't her own volition that she just decided, from Colleen to Cameron, my sweetheart. It was from slave to master because this is what you told me to do. And so it was pretty clear that those were instruments, again, of coercion. But again, the problem was that the kidnapping charge had happened before the statute of limitations. And so he freely admitted right off the bat that he'd kidnapped her. But what Christine did was that she looked at another case that had happened. A young boy, I'm going to forget his name now. It starts with an S. Gosh, a young boy had been kidnapped and held captive. I think he was kidnapped when he was 7 or 8 and held for many years. And in that case, they were able to prove continuous kidnapping. And in that case, then it can't lapse because the kidnapping never ended. It's a perpetual state. And so she was able to prove that this was continual kidnapping. But all of this was so iffy. I mean, it seems strange to us now because after Elizabeth Smart and J.C. DeGard and those 3 women held in Ohio, I mean, we've become educated now as a population to Stockholm Syndrome and these terrible, horrible crimes. But at that point, people just couldn't fathom this. And even after the whole case had been presented, because, of course, there was an expert witness also from Stanford on the defense side testifying that, what Colleen said happened couldn't be technically true and that he didn't really believe in this, brainwashing aspect and on and on. So you had the 2 experts, sounding off against each other. And when the jury went out, the press corps actually was wagering whether or not he would be set free. And Cameron, even at the conclusion of closing arguments, he turned to the bailiff and he smiled and said, "I know I'm going home tomorrow." He was that confident. So it was a huge relief to everyone when they came back and found him guilty. They were actually hung on 1 or 2 counts, I think. But they did finally find him guilty.
Let's get to, because this is very unusual, number one, the cast of characters here. You just mentioned the couple star witnesses, but it's a battle of the experts. And Christine McGuire had interviewed both of these experts, and they both had agreed to be for the prosecution, be a witness for the prosecution. She chose Dr. Hatcher, and then the other person that she had spoke to, she was surprised, working for Papendick and being
Dr.
totally,
Lundy,
again, yes, Dr. Lundy.
Yes.
So
but
the other thing was,
the jury didn't know that.
The other thing is that Colleen took the stand. First, Janice took the stand. Colleen takes the stand, and then, very, very, very unusual, Cameron takes the stand. So we got to go to let's go back to when Janice first approached police. She had a story that was even more bizarre than the Colleen Stan abduction and torture story. There was another one about Marie Elizabeth Spanicki. So tell us what she told police and why the police were unable to act upon what she had witnessed.
This still gives me chills. I mean, there are tears in my eyes right now, even thinking about Marie Elizabeth Spanicki. Her nickname was Marliz. And this had been weighing on Janice all this time. So this is the other element that had been working on her psyche. In 1976, January of 1976, Miss Spanicki in Chico, which is about 40 miles east of Red Bluff, in Chico, I believe she'd had a fight with her boyfriend, so she was walking home, and Cameron and Janice drive up, and Cameron offers her a ride. And so she gets in the car, and they take her, to where she's going, and she starts to get out, and he grabs her and subdues her and takes her back to the house. So very much like what happened with Colleen. He picks up a woman off the side of the street and rushes back to the house. But in this case, Marliz didn't behave as he wanted her to behave. And he cut her throat, first of all. He tried to cut out her voice box. And then she asked for pen and paper and wrote down, please let me go. My boyfriend will pay a ransom. And he refused. And I believe he shot her with a pellet gun and then ultimately strangled her and murdered her. And so he had...
And they buried her.
Take her, they load her in the car, they drove out at night into the woods, and they buried her. And so Janice confessed this to the police, and they read her rights, immediately. She confessed this before she told them about Colleen. And they looked for the body, but they could not find her body. And Marliz Spanicki did disappear on the night she said. She was wearing what Janice described. I mean, there's no way Janice would have known the things about her that she knew unless that was true. But that is legally not enough to prosecute someone. Now, I believe down to my toes that Cameron Hooker murdered that girl.
Sure.
And I also believe that if Colleen Stan had resisted, that he would have murdered her too. And it is because she did what she was told and didn't fight back that she's alive today.
Now, you put in your book, and this is not the first book that there's a reference to this famous fictional book called The Collector by John Fowles, but you have a quote from it. Tell us just briefly why John Fowles' The Collector is important to this story.
That is an uncanny book because of Stockholm Syndrome. And Stockholm Syndrome, just briefly, came out of a bank robbery situation in Stockholm. I believe it was in 1953. And the bank robbers locked 8 hostages in a vault for 3 days, I believe. And that was the first case where they observed that the hostages started to bond with their captors. And so that's why it became Stockholm Syndrome. And you see the same kind of bonding, in a sense, between captor and captive in POW situations, prison guards who are taken hostage during riots, all kinds of those kinds of situations. Remind me again, why am I giving you this background? Whoops, I lost my train of thought. I'm telling you about Stockholm Syndrome because...
We wanted to talk about her original story about the abduction, and you said it was important to understand Stockholm Syndrome in that particular case as well.
Oh, and the story
in relation to Colleen.
And also about The Collector, sorry. So what was uncanny about The Collector by John Fowles, which is fiction, is that he writes alternating chapters, alternating points of view, one from the captor and one from the captive. And he is so spot on the psychology of both of those individuals. Even though, Stockholm Syndrome wasn't widely understood, he has just an unerring sense for what that relationship is like, how you try to identify what makes your captor tick and please him because he can kill you if you don't. And so I do quote him in the book, and I recommend that book frequently, even though it's not well known, but it's not well known anymore. But it's a really, really terrific fictionalized version of what really did happen in this case.
It also speaks to Cameron's fantasy as very much the main character in The Collector, that after the abduction, that the woman would then come to love her captor, and the sex slave relationship would be consensual and loving and morph into something, again, the fantasy that's contained in The Collector. And also, it seems, not only Cameron Hooker, there's other serial killers that have noted this book as one of their favorites and inspiration of sorts.
That's correct. And then there's another thing that I just recalled too.
Sure.
Is that there is a movie, The Story of O.
Right.
And that was Cameron Hooker's favorite movie. And so, like O, who was a slave, his slave, he gave just a one initial. People would call her K and think that it's K-A-Y, but it was really just the initial K was the slave name that he gave her.
Yes, there was incredible parallels with that movie, and at one time, Christine McGuire tried to have that deemed admissible at trial, but Judge Knight thought it would be more prejudicial than probative. What I found the most fascinating was that Christine McGuire made the best decision in having her psychiatric expert, and that he did a masterful job of doing his research and finding 16 coercive techniques that he outlined at trial. And he talked about historically how slaves escaped, yet could have escaped, yet didn't. So he explained psychologically in very easy to relate terms for the jury exactly what these coercive techniques were, and he outlined them, and also pointed out where Cameron obviously got his inspiration from some of the material and the newspapers and the literature that Cameron had and were exhibits at trial.
It was so enlightening listening to him. Dr. Hatcher was an associate clinical professor with the Langley Porter Institute in San Francisco, and his credentials, I mean, it took him 10 minutes just to explain his credentials, but he was fascinating in explaining how coercion exists on a continuum, that you can think about, someone being dominant in a relationship, like they're the one who says, when you go shopping, buy this, buy that, this is what we're having for dinner, or then, a more overt kind of domination to the point where you have at the extreme end what Cameron Hooker subjected Colleen Stan to. And also this idea of, that, yes, there are people that participate willingly in bondage as sex play, but that is a consensual relationship, again, on a continuum. So, you might, there's one thing to have a little bit of biting or pulling of hair might be stimulating in a playful way, but that's not the same as torturing someone for your pleasure. That if you like to inflict pain on someone else as a stimulation, that's completely at the other end of the continuum. So it was really interesting to listen to him talk about how this kind of prolonged captivity breaks down your will, that you're reduced to the state of an infant, and that you're so dependent on this other person for your basic human functions that you haven't, since you were an infant, you haven't had to, soil yourself because they wouldn't let you go to the bathroom, or, that you were so dependent on someone just simply for some food and water. And it just breaks you down psychologically. And, soldiers are trained to resist this. Ordinary people are not trained to resist this, and even someone trained can be broken down and made to do what their captor wants them to do. The other thing I want to talk about, too, a little bit is just the difference between kidnapping situations. It's something different if you're held captive and there is some negotiation for your release, and you know that if someone pays the ransom that you will be set free. There's hope there that you can get out. But what she was subjected to was utterly hopeless. There was no negotiation. No one knew she was there. There was no way that he would ever let her go. Her only hope was to escape. And so Janice really was the key to that.
Now, Dr. Hatcher also, he explained, again, like you had mentioned, that using a bedpan, having no privacy, the isolation, the sensory deprivation, the punishment for no seeming reason, and then sort of reward, all of these things are, as Dr. Hatcher outlined, textbook to break someone, to reduce someone, to coerce someone. And then that led to the logical explanation on how on earth, because Colleen on the stand was not having an easy time, so he explained the flat, unemotional effect that she had that seemed very foreign to everybody, including the media and everybody, because it's foreign to them. It's totally unexperienced in this unprecedented case. So what he also explained is how on earth she could have written those letters. And like you say, line by line, he explained the phone calls and the letters and her expression of love for Cameron Hooker.
That's right. He went through all of those techniques, the disrupting of night and day patterns, the refusal to answer questions, the constant threats, the shame and control, and abuse, reward and punishment for no reason, that you have to ask permission even to go to the bathroom, and the extreme isolation and deprivation, and how that breaks you down. And then he also explained how after you've gone through that for a period of time, initially you might scream and cry and be upset, but when you've been so close to death, basically so many times, it starts to lose its impact. That hopelessness kind of pervades your whole personality. So, when you talk about what happened to you, you're not going to, sitting on a stand talking is not frightening. Being clothed in front of people you might have some stage fright. You might be nervous, but it's not anything like, someone holding you underwater. I mean, this is the term, before I ever heard the term waterboarding. I mean, they, almost drowned her. And he taped electrical wires to her breasts and her thighs and electrocuted her. I mean, after that kind of extreme horror, she was not an emotional person. And even today, she's fairly soft-spoken. I mean, she does now laugh, which is refreshing to hear. And she does have hope and love in her life, thank God. But at that time, it was. I know that Christine was concerned that the jury wouldn't believe her, partly because she wasn't histrionic. But she wasn't histrionic because of what she'd gone through.
Now, again, I talked about a very surprising and unusual turn of events is Cameron Hooker takes the stand. And so for those that are uninitiated, the direct examination can put forward all kinds of, we'll say, stories, we'll say, tales, fictional tales even. But then there's always the direct examination and the opportunity for the prosecutor to really zero in on those inconsistencies and outward lies and have the prosecutor's way with them to discredit that person as a witness. So tell us about Cameron Hooker's testimony and Christine McGuire's cross-examination.
Well, when he took the stand, he had a very kind of good old boy attitude, and And during the direct examination under Papendick, I remember him talking about how, he was a Boy Scout and he learned to make knots as a Boy Scout. I mean, he was trying to portray himself as kind of this wholesome guy. And then when she really was brilliant in the way she grilled him and caught him in inconsistencies and just brought up the facts, and showed how he, how callous he had been about these things that he had done. I mean, here in the courtroom was the box. Christine brought in the box that he'd kept her locked in under the bed. There's a picture of it in the book. And I know some of the jurors actually tried on the head box and laid down in the box during their deliberations. And that was such a testament. And then she brought in a huge photograph that he had taken of Colleen blindfolded and quite thin, suspended by her wrists, naked. And that kind of evidence was just so glaring in contrast to the sort of wholesome, loving relationship he was hoping to pretend that they had. So I don't remember him getting upset or ever raising his voice or anything. I think that he honestly thought that that the prosecution had no case. I think he really genuinely believed that. And I need to bring up also, or I'd like to bring up now, that he was sentenced to 104 years. And we thought he would never be set free, even with time off for good behavior. But recently, California changed the law, and they have made it mandatory that anyone over the age of 60 who has served 25 years of their sentence is up for early release. And so Colleen contacted me in January, very upset that he was going to be having a hearing,
right,
and that she was going to have to face him. And so there was a hearing April 16th, and Colleen rallied her courage, and she testified against him. We had a letter writing campaign to people to protest his release, because clearly this is the kind of person who sees that he did nothing wrong. He's never expressed any remorse, and I believe strongly that psychopaths can't be rehabilitated. I've researched that somewhat and wrote about that for The Atlantic. And part of the thing is that they don't see anything wrong with themselves. So why should they change, right? And psychopathy actually exists also on a continuum. I mean, some psychopaths run corporations, or the likelihood is that all of us have met someone during our lives who basically lacks empathy. But to be a sadist and a psychopath to the extreme level that he is again at the far end of the spectrum. But luckily, the parole board recognized what a cruel person he is, and that he has no remorse, and so he's still in prison.
He will still have he will be entitled to another parole hearing in a few years, though, won't he?
Someone asked me that recently, and I thought, gosh, I should have asked Colleen that. I didn't at the time, but I imagine, yes, that he will be up for review again within a few years. I hope he just dies in prison between now and then.
Yeah, well, the thing is, too, the parole board, it seems to be, especially in America, and especially in high-profile cases, and especially with witnesses, and again, especially a case like this, where the public sentiment, the public outcry can affect a parole hearings decision. And I mean, who would want to be the guy that let this guy out? who would want to be the guy that signs that order, saying, "Oh, sure, I think this guy is okay now." So, and to talk about his lack of remorse, because I don't think these people really, truthfully ever have any remorse. But to show you how he really thought about things is that he said he had a computer and some games and 3 squares, and at least it was better than living with those 2 women.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So he's happy.
I think he's where he belongs. I mean, he certainly shouldn't be set free. He's a danger to women. As long as he'll be set free. I'd like to talk, if I might, for just a moment about my fiction, because this case haunted me. After when I finished Perfect Victim, I really thought, okay, nothing that horrible will ever happen again, and now I'm going to get on with my life. But every time, of course, there was any kind of case like this, Elizabeth Smart or J.C. DeGard, it all came back to me, and I've maintained contact with Colleen over the years. And what I wanted to do was write fiction about a survivor of kidnapping and captivity as a way of kind of almost a cathartic way of dealing with that crime. And so I wrote a crime novel. The title is The Edge of Normal, and the protagonist is 22. She was kidnapped when she was 12 and held for 4 years, so not as extreme as what Colleen went through, but more extreme than what Elizabeth Smart went through. And so she's my heroine, and in a way, Perfect Victim is talking about the crime and the victimization. And then The Edge of Normal is my way of talking about the survivor. And she is called upon to help another girl who's survived that kind of case. And there's a character, Dr. Lerner, who's roughly patterned after Dr. Chris Hatcher, who's the forensic psychiatrist, the expert on captivity syndromes, who's her psychiatrist. And when I wrote The Edge of Normal, I was really nervous about what Colleen would think. So, of course, I sent her a copy. And a few days after she received it, she called me up. And I steeled myself because I was really afraid she was going to be upset about it. And she said, "I want to thank you because I feel like you really listened to me, that you really understand." And it just gave me chills. And then I've just recently, actually the sequel is coming out at the end of this month. It's called What Doesn't Kill Her. And in a way, that's inspired by this possibility of Cameron Hooker being released because, of course, my first thought was, if he is released, I hope somebody just shoots him, which I know is a terrible thing to say. I don't really mean that, don't call the police. But that's that's viscerally what you feel is that, he should not be ever set free. And so that inspired the idea of the second book in which the captor, the kidnapper, breaks out of prison. And how do you deal with that person being back on the street? So, in a way, I'm still trying to grapple with the emotional issues. I'm still obsessed with evil. I'm, interviewing experts about psychopaths and talking to the FBI and kind of fixated on those cases. And it's fascinating to me the resilience of someone who's gone through that sort of thing. And also there's a bonding between survivors. I hadn't realized this, but after J.C. DeGard escaped or was rescued, I started looking at some of the publications that survivors have written. And actually, if you do enough research, there is a publication that I think it's put out by the National Center for I'm trying to think of the group. Anyway, it's a governmental agency, and it's a collection of stories by survivors, and Elizabeth Smart contributed to that and some others, and they really do try to help each other, survivors of kidnapping. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that's what I'm trying to think of. There are techniques, actually, for reclaiming your life and beginning to feel safe again after you've been through that kind of horrific situation.
What was Colleen Stan's reaction to the new law that made Cameron Hooker eligible for parole?
You could hear the panic in her voice. It generally, when you're talking to her, she sounds, just like anyone that you would meet. But when the possibility of Cameron getting out again comes up, it's really like, a switch has been flipped, and that she, I think she remembers so clearly then what has happened, and she knows what he can do. And it's a state of distress that I think really absorbed her life for months. That this fear, although I have to give her credit at how she has dealt with it. She's been phenomenal.
Yeah.
She spoke to a victims group in Northern California, and shared her story. It was the first time she'd publicly come out, and I think this was videotaped. It might have been on television. I think I got some glimpses on my computer, and she's put together a very cohesive case for putting him away, and I'm hoping that in a way that was cathartic for her, that she again faced him and had that affirmation that he's not going anywhere, and that she's able now to reach out to others. She's had such a hard and amazing life. I mean, even beyond this trial, and I've been encouraging her to work on her memoir. Although I'm sure that that's quite stressful for her.
It's incredible. Your book, again, it more than touches on it, because it really somehow explains how Colleen persevered through this, through Bible, through little glimmers of hope, the little privileges that she did get when she did get to speak to her family on the phone, when she did get to go visit. All those things were very precious to her. And again, you said she did have a religious experience or a spiritual experience. It's incredible resilience. Under resilience in the dictionary should have a photo of her. And then when you see her in the book, her eyes are so compassionate, and yet you can't imagine anybody living and enduring what she did for those 7 years and then not being vengeful and bitter and hateful. It's incredible.
If there's anyone that should have never had to endure that, it's Colleen. She's a very sweet person, and she deserves kindness and goodness in her life. And I wish that there were wonderful things that I could dow upon her, because I know that she has wonderful people in her life supporting her, and that's good. But I also know that she's had some very, very hard times. And still, she's just a dear, wonderful person. And thank God she did have some religion in her life, and she prayed, and she, would relive in her mind her favorite memories with her family and her childhood and places that she had been. And to try to imagine being, locked in a box, I mean, it really is, it's solitary confinement. It's inhuman kind of treatment that she endured. But thankfully she did survive it, and, she's gone on to live her life. And she said that, one thing that surprised her is that people would they're always complaining about things. And she realizes how lucky we all are, every day, and that makes her appreciate all the wonderful experience every day if we just, look at them, look at the real situation.
Yeah, and this story too is a story of survival, but there are some heroes in this and dedicated people who go over and beyond the call of any kind of duty to try to get revenge, try to get justice for, again, Marie Elizabeth Sponicky, and for Janice, and for Colleen, and really the justice that Cameron Hooker deserved, which is to spend the rest of his life in prison and be denounced as the monster he really was. So I really want to thank you for coming on and talking about this. For those that might be interested in contacting you, do you have a website or do you Facebook? Tell us how people might be able to contact you or learn more about your work.
Thank you. Yes, it's carlanorton.com, and I'm one of several Carla Nortons on Facebook. So it's Carla Norton, novelist and true crime writer. You can't miss me. And on Twitter, I'm I'm at Carla J. Norton. So those ways are the best ways to reach me, and you can contact me through my website anytime.
Absolutely, and like I mentioned before in the commercial break, Perfect Victim is available as an audible audiobook and in paperback and in ebook form, and so you can get a copy of this true crime classic. I want to thank you very much, Carla, for coming on and talking about Perfect Victim. It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much, and you have a great evening.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks so much.
Good night.
Good night now.